The night my sister laughed while a room full of strangers mocked my military service was the night I realized something no combat mission had ever taught me. It's easier to face enemy fire at 30,000 feet than it is to stand unprotected in a ballroom full of people who are supposed to love you. My name is Danielle Prescott. I'm 34 years old. I've spent the last 12 years flying F-16s for the United States Air Force. I've deployed 3 times. I've missed Christmas 5 years in a row. I've buried friends. I've brought my squadron home alive. And yet, none of that prepared me for what happened at my sister's wedding. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when people underestimated you, make sure you like and subscribe. Because this story isn't just about a wedding. It's about respect. I flew in from Nellis Air Force Base 3 days before the ceremony. I had burned leave I couldn't really afford to take. My squadron was preparing for a major evaluation, and my presence mattered. But family mattered too. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I stood in the back of a hotel ballroom in Indianapolis, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched. My younger sister, Caroline, glided across the dance floor in a custom ivory gown that probably cost more than my first car. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over 200 guests. Everything looked perfect. The kind of perfect that only exists in curated Instagram posts and expensive event planning contracts. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Danielle. You made it. Caroline had squealed at the rehearsal dinner the night before, hugging me quickly before stepping back to scan my outfit. I had chosen a simple emerald dress. Elegant. Understated. Professional. Oh. That's what you're wearing, she'd asked, smiling too brightly. It's great. Just, maybe tomorrow don't wear your uniform. We want it relaxed. Not all military. I nodded. I hadn't even planned to wear my uniform. But somehow the comment lingered. Relaxed meant not me. At the reception, I found my seat card at table 14, near the service doors. My parents were at table 3. The wedding party was up front. I was seated with distant relatives and 2 guys from the groom's investment firm. One of them, a man named Tyler with too much confidence and not enough depth, leaned toward me halfway through dinner. So you're the Air Force sister, he said. What do you fly? Cargo? I told him I flew F-16s. He laughed like I had told a joke. Wait. For real? Like actual fighter jets? They let women do that? He tried to backpedal. I mean, that's awesome. Just didn't know. I smiled tightly. I've been asked that question in a dozen variations over the years. It never stops being exhausting. The best man's toast started normally. Stories from college. Inside jokes. Harmless embarrassment. Then his eyes found me. And let's not forget Caroline's big sister, Danielle. She's in the Air Force. A major, apparently. Light applause. I nodded politely. I had to Google what that means, he continued. Sounds like middle management for jets. Laughter rippled across the room. So Danielle, do you actually fly them? Or is it more like meetings about flying? More laughter. I felt my mother's gaze from across the ballroom. That look that says, please don't react. My father stared at his water glass. The best man kept going. I mean, no offense. It's just funny how people think military means Top Gun, but it's probably a lot of paperwork, right? Caroline laughed. Not cruelly. Not maliciously. Just, along with everyone else. I excused myself before the toast ended. I walked toward the bar because I needed air. Because I needed space. Because I suddenly understood that I had been reduced to a punchline in a room full of people who had never once asked what my job actually required. Glenlivet. Neat. The voice beside me was calm, steady, authoritative. I glanced over. A man in his late 60s stood at the bar. Tuxedo. Perfect posture. Eyes sharp. Thomas Reed, he said. Father of the groom. I introduced myself. When I shifted my wrist to lift my drink, the edge of my tattoo showed. A faded falcon insignia over coordinates. His glass paused midair. Falcon 7, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. My pulse quickened. Yes, sir. He straightened slightly. You earned that in Al Dafra. It wasn't common knowledge. I nodded once. He set his drink down deliberately. Then he turned toward the head table. Evan, he called to the best man. Come here. The room quieted in waves. Conversations faded. Music softened. Evan approached, confusion written across his face. Sir? Thomas Reed didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're going to apologize to Major Prescott. Right now. Evan blinked. I was joking. You disrespected a combat pilot, Thomas replied evenly. You mocked service you don't understand. You will correct that. Silence fell heavy across 200 guests. Evan turned toward me. His confidence had evaporated. Major Prescott. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I held his gaze. You didn't ask, I said calmly. That landed harder than anger ever could. Thomas Reed faced the room. For clarity, he said, voice carrying without effort, Major Danielle Prescott has flown combat sorties in hostile airspace. She has earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. She has led missions that saved American lives. Show respect. No one laughed this time. The shift in the room was palpable. Caroline stood frozen at the head table. Our eyes met. Something unspoken passed between us. Not quite understanding. Not yet. I didn't stay long after that. I congratulated my sister. I hugged my parents. I left before dessert. Because the truth was, the apology wasn't the thing that hurt. It was realizing that it took a retired general's voice for people to see my worth. And that was the moment I knew something in my family dynamic had to change. I drove back to my hotel that night with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Combat teaches you to identify threats quickly. But sometimes the hardest battles aren't overseas. Sometimes they're in ballrooms. And what happened the next morning at the post-wedding brunch? That's where the real confrontation began. The brunch the next morning was supposed to be casual. Soft music. Mimosas. Smiling photos before the newlyweds left for their honeymoon. Instead, it became the moment everything I had been swallowing for years finally came up to the surface. I arrived at 11 sharp. On time. As always. My mother glanced at her watch and said lightly, "You and that military timing." It was meant to be a joke, but it felt like another reminder that I didn't quite fit in their world. Caroline and her husband sat at the center table, glowing, retelling highlights from the reception as if the night had unfolded flawlessly. No one mentioned the toast. No one mentioned the silence that followed. No one mentioned me. I took a seat near the windows. My father joined me after a few minutes, carrying coffee and fruit. Hell of a night, he said, almost impressed. Didn't know you were such a decorated officer. I looked at him carefully. You never asked. He blinked. Not defensive. Just confused. We didn't know what to ask. That was the moment it hit me. It wasn't just ignorance. It was distance. 12 years of missed birthdays, cancelled holidays, half-finished phone calls, and conversations that never went deeper than surface-level updates had built a gap none of us knew how to cross. My mother sat down and lowered her voice. Sweetheart, about last night, maybe it didn't need to turn into such a scene. There it was. The word scene. As if I had caused it. I didn't create it, I replied calmly. I just didn't shrink when it happened. She sighed. People don't understand the military the way you do. Then maybe they should ask instead of assume. My father shifted uncomfortably. We're proud of you, he said. You know that. I held his gaze. Are you proud of the idea of me? Or do you actually know who I am? Silence. That kind of silence that forces people to examine themselves. Caroline approached then, still in her bridal glow but with tension in her shoulders. Can we not do this right now? She whispered. This weekend was supposed to be perfect. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Clarity. Perfect for who? I asked gently. Because I've been bending myself smaller for years to make things easier for everyone else. She crossed her arms. You're always gone, Danielle. You miss everything. And then you come back and it feels like we're supposed to understand this huge world you live in that we've never seen. Her honesty surprised me. It wasn't accusation. It was frustration mixed with insecurity. I didn't realize you felt that way, I said. You chose that life, she replied. Yes, I answered. I did. And I don't regret it. But I never chose to be invisible. That conversation didn't end with a dramatic reconciliation. It ended unfinished. Raw. I left the brunch early. I drove straight to the airport and switched my flight. I needed to be back where things made sense. Where performance mattered more than perception. The desert air hit me like a reset button when I stepped off the plane in Nevada. The hum of jets overhead felt like home. On Monday morning, I reported in early, still in my dress blues from travel. Colonel Hayes called me into his office after briefing. Heard about the wedding, he said quietly. Military networks are small. You handled it well. I nodded. Sir, I'm fine. He studied me. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if you're ready for more responsibility. He slid a folder across his desk. My performance evaluations. Outstanding across the board. I'm putting you up for Lieutenant Colonel, he said. The words landed heavier than I expected. It wasn't just rank. It was recognition. Institutional trust. You've earned it, he continued. But leadership at that level means visibility. It means you stop being just excellent at flying and start shaping people. I understood what he was really asking. Could I lead people through emotional complexity the same way I led missions through chaos? Yes, sir, I answered. And I meant it. The next few months were relentless. Squadron evaluations. Training cycles. Mentorship sessions with junior pilots who were struggling to balance operational pressure with personal life. I started noticing something. The same isolation I felt at that ballroom? Many of them felt it too. Service creates distance. Not just geographically. Emotionally. One afternoon, a young lieutenant named Harper stayed after debrief. "Ma'am, how do you explain this job to people who don't get it?" I thought about Caroline. About my parents. About that brunch. "You don't," I said finally. "You show up consistently. You let your work speak. And you stop apologizing for being committed." In November, the promotion board results came in. I made lieutenant colonel. When Colonel Hayes pinned the silver oak leaves on my uniform, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't in a long time. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving myself right. I called my parents that night. My mother cried. My father said, "We're coming to the ceremony." No hesitation. Just certainty. Caroline called later. "I want to be there too," she said quietly. "If that's okay." I didn't make her beg. "Of course it's okay." The ceremony in December was small but powerful. My squadron stood behind me. My parents in the front row. Caroline beside them, holding my mother's hand. When the oath was read and my new rank announced, I saw something shift in my father's expression. Not pride in a concept. Pride in understanding. Afterward, Caroline pulled me aside. "I've been reading," she admitted. "About your missions. About what it takes to earn that medal." I smiled faintly. "It's not about medals." "I know," she said. "It's about responsibility." That word meant everything. Responsibility. Not glory. Not ego. Responsibility. Later that evening, as the sun set over the Nevada mountains, Caroline stood beside me on the flight line. Jets roared in the distance. "I think I resented you," she confessed. "You left. You built this huge life. And I stayed. I didn't interrupt. But now I see it differently. You didn't leave us. You expanded." I felt that land deep in my chest. "We both chose our paths," I said. "Neither one is smaller." She nodded. "I'm still learning how to be your sister." "Me too," I replied. Healing wasn't instant. It wasn't cinematic. It was incremental. It was choosing to call more often. It was my parents asking real questions instead of polite ones. It was Caroline visiting the base the following spring and watching me brief a room full of officers. It was her seeing that leadership wasn't loud. It was steady. And something else was shifting inside me too. That night at the wedding had forced a boundary I didn't even realize I needed. I stopped explaining myself defensively. I stopped shrinking to make rooms more comfortable. I started standing fully in my competence without waiting for permission. But the biggest transformation didn't happen in Indiana. It happened at the Air Force Academy 6 months later, when I stood in front of a room full of cadets and realized that my story wasn't just mine anymore. And that's when everything changed again. 6 months after my promotion, I stood at the front of a lecture hall at the United States Air Force Academy, looking out at 40 newly commissioned second lieutenants who were about to begin the same journey I had started more than a decade earlier. Their uniforms were crisp. Their posture was tight. Their futures felt enormous and uncertain. I introduced myself simply. Lieutenant Colonel Danielle Prescott. Call sign Falcon 7. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. Some of them had read about one of my deployments. A few had looked up the citation from my Distinguished Flying Cross. But what they didn't know yet was the part of my story that had nothing to do with combat. "Let me tell you something you won't read in any manual," I began. "The hardest part of this career won't be flying. It won't be the check rides or the evaluations. It will be learning how to stand in rooms where people don't understand you and not shrink. I didn't mention the wedding. I didn't need to. I could see it in their faces, especially the women. They already knew what I meant. After class, a cadet named Elena approached me. "Ma'am, how do you deal with people who assume you're less capable?" I didn't hesitate. "You don't argue. You perform. Excellence is the most efficient rebuttal." She nodded slowly, absorbing it. Teaching changed me. In the cockpit, everything is precise. Inputs create outputs. Airspeed, altitude, vector. Leadership is Messier. Mentoring young officers meant listening to doubts I had once buried in myself. It meant helping them navigate family conversations about deployments. It meant being honest about sacrifice. I started incorporating those conversations into my curriculum. Tactical awareness wasn't just about enemy aircraft. It was about self-awareness. Emotional resilience. Knowing your worth before someone tries to define it for you. My relationship with my family evolved quietly in the background. My parents began calling not just to check in, but to ask specifics. "What does a training cycle look like?" my father asked one Sunday. "How many pilots are under your command?" My mother started reading articles about women in combat aviation and texting me screenshots. Caroline visited twice that year. The second time, she brought her husband, and he asked thoughtful questions about sortie planning instead of making jokes. Growth doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small, deliberate corrections. 2 years after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a National Women in Aviation conference in Chicago. 300 attendees filled the ballroom. Students, executives, veteran pilots. I stepped onto that stage remembering another ballroom, years earlier, where laughter had cut differently. This time, the energy was focused. Intentional. When I was 18, I told my family I wanted to fly fighter jets. They didn't understand. And that's okay. You don't need universal understanding to pursue excellence. I spoke about the academy. About training. About earning a call sign in combat. But I also spoke about boundaries. About refusing to become smaller for someone else's comfort. During the Q&A, a teenage girl in the front row asked, "Did you ever feel like quitting because people doubted you?" I smiled. Of course. Doubt is normal. Letting it decide for you is optional. Applause followed. Afterward, Caroline found me near the exit. "You were incredible," she said. I didn't know half of that. I laughed softly. "You never asked." She didn't get defensive this time. She just nodded. "I'm asking now." 5 years after that wedding, we were back in the same city for my niece's first birthday. Same hotel ballroom. Different energy. I walked in wearing civilian clothes, relaxed, grounded. No tension in my shoulders. Caroline greeted me with a hug that lasted longer than it used to. "Emma's going to grow up knowing exactly who her aunt is," she said. I crouched beside my niece's high chair and thought about legacy. Not medals. Not rank. Impact. Later that evening, Thomas Reed approached me again. Older now. Slower. "Colonel Prescott," he said warmly. I had made full colonel the previous year. 20 years of service. "I still tell that story sometimes," he admitted. About the wedding. I raised an eyebrow. "Not to embarrass you," he clarified. "To remind people that assumptions are dangerous." I appreciated that. Ryan, the former best man, shook my hand with genuine respect. He had matured too. He had daughters now. Perspective changes men. Driving back to my hotel that night, I reflected on the journey. The wedding had been painful, yes. But it had forced something necessary. It forced me to define my boundary clearly. To stop negotiating my worth. To stop waiting for rooms to validate me. Respect is not something you beg for. It's something you embody consistently until people either rise to meet it or remove themselves. My family chose to rise. That mattered. At the academy now, I tell my cadets something I wish someone had told me at 22. Your career will demand excellence. Your relationships will demand vulnerability. Neither one requires you to disappear. They write that down. I see them absorb it. And sometimes, after class, one will linger and ask how to talk to their parents about deployments. Or how to maintain connection when distance feels overwhelming. I don't give them a script. I give them honesty. Invite them into your world, I say. But don't dim your light if they hesitate. I am 41 now. Still serving. Still flying occasionally to stay current. Still mentoring. I have spoken at conferences, advised on training reforms, and helped shape policy for integrating more women into combat aviation roles. None of that was the plan when I was 18. The only plan was to fly. The rest unfolded because I kept showing up. If you've ever been underestimated at a family gathering. If you've ever laughed something off just to keep the peace. If you've ever wondered whether you should have spoken up. I see you. I've been there. The question isn't whether you deserve respect. You do. The question is whether you're willing to hold your ground long enough for others to recognize it. So tell me in the comments. Have you ever stayed quiet when you shouldn't have? What would you say differently now? And if this story resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that excellence doesn't require permission. I read every comment. I'll see you in the next story about boundaries, growth, and what happens when you stop shrinking for rooms that were never built to contain you.